I think sometimes in our society, we want to move really fast. We've got, and especially when we're in crisis, it's like, what's the next thing to do? What's the next change? And then people get left behind. And it's like, who has enough resources gets to move forward. And I think we're trying to reorient us and say, yes, we need to meet needs. And how do we do that collectively versus just the individual?
And so one of the things that I challenge myself to is to realize that the problems that are in front of me are not for me to solve. They're to solve me. They're to fix me. In other words, I can't address that problem, but how do I change so that I'm not contributing to that problem?
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for episode 20, I spoke with Ralph Frid, who is a systems engineer who volunteers his time with the BVSD District Accountability Committee as the chair of the Budget and Finance Subcommittee, and Meghan Carrier, who is the deputy director of Together Colorado, which is a nonprofit that brings faith communities together to work on issues such as immigration, healthcare, criminal justice, and affordable housing, among others. Ralph came to my attention at a BVSD board meeting in January, where he talked about how enrollment trends, the rising cost of housing, and staff shortages are converging to create difficult challenges for the district. Enrollment is going down, housing costs are going up, and teachers and other staff cannot afford to live here. One bullet item in his presentation that stood out for me included the following, quote, repurposing of BVSD properties as affordable housing for BVSD employees, first responders, etc., end quote. Of course, I was eager to hear more about that. Ralph admitted that he was not a housing expert, and so he recruited Meghan to join our conversation. This was exciting for me because last year I attended Together Colorado's series on housing in Boulder County, and so I was already familiar with their great work. Ralph and Meghan proved to be great conversation partners as we explored ways that we can make Boulder a more welcoming and inclusive community. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ralph Frid and Meghan Carrier. Hi, Ralph and Meghan. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I started asking Ralph what his title was, and he gave me too long of a title. So go ahead and have each in turn introduce yourselves, please.
So I'm Ralph Frid, and I am chair of the Budget and Finance Committee for the District Accountability Committee that serves Boulder Valley School District. And I've been working volunteer on that committee for probably 5 years now. And my focus is on one of the poorest schools in the school district. So that's my background and kind of how we got acquainted. Meghan?
Yes, thanks for having me on. My name is Meghan Carrier. I'm the Deputy Director of Together Colorado. I've been with the organization for almost 11 years now. As a quick just note as to who Together Colorado is, we are a statewide grassroots organization that does grassroots community organizing through faith communities. We are building a faith and race solidarity movement. And really our goal across the state is to unlock the power of the people through faith-driven community organizing and really bring human dignity to the center of all our public life and work in this state.
Great, thank you so much for being here today. So I wanted to tell you, Ralph, how I got connected with you. My wife is one of the representatives for the District Accountability Committee for one of the BVSD schools. And she got off this phone call back in December where she was like, hey, this guy's talking about housing in BVSD and maybe, the possibility of using BVSD properties to reimagine them as possible sites for affordable housing. I was like, whoa, that's amazing. I can't believe someone's saying that out loud. That actually works for the school district. So you actually did say it out loud. So this came up in the last BVSD board meeting, and you had it right out there. It was like, hey, we should consider. So tell me about how that came about.
So this is a really interesting intersection. And the intersection looks like this. 3 years ago or 4 years ago, the school district was the absolute ideal place for people to seek work with. They had more applications than they could take. Fast forward, we're now in a place where we're having a difficult time getting substitutes, can't get enough cafeteria workers. We've had 2 or 3 years of difficulty staffing all the bus drivers. And so we have an intersection of need within the school district for people to live within the district, to be able to live local and work local. Okay. So that's been a growing need within the district. And so as we look at affordability for what you and I would call state certified teachers or certified healthcare workers, it's getting more and more difficult. Okay. And so this year we gave an interesting recommendation to the Board of Education, which was to collaborate with our other community organizations. That would be the county superintendents, city mayors, and give them the forecast of what we're going to be looking at for school closures to see, as good stewards, what would be the best utilization of that property for the needs of the community. In other words, on the west side of BVSD, the community is aging. We're having fewer and fewer elementary school students enroll each year. It's been a trend that's been here for more than a decade, and it's going to continue. And so it gives us an opportunity to look at how do we repurpose some of the resources that we have so that other segments of the community can thrive in a way that the school district benefits from the well-being of kind of this, what you and I would call an opportunity for people to live and work in one location, right? As opposed to living 40 miles away in community. So that's how this got started. And it was really the intersection of all of these different forces, both social, economic, and certainly in the area of housing the last 4 years, we have seen housing prices just literally go beyond reach for almost anyone in a community. So if we look at a resident that grew up in Lafayette or Louisville, and they went to college, they got themselves a job, maybe they're an engineer for the fire department, they can't afford to live in the city they grew up in. So that's how the intersection of need and resource kind of collided.
Would you mind just summarizing what you recommended to the board, the BVSD
Sure.
board?
So our recommendation was pretty specific in the sense of saying, bring the experts to the table, share the data that you have, and build trust in the community. And this is on 3 or 4 different dimensions. So there's certainly housing, mental health for students. That's another area that's in real need. And in that category, the American Pediatric Association was encouraging its members to start participating with schools to help them because the issues have gotten so complex. 10 years ago, the issues that school boards looked at were significantly different than the ones that we're looking at today. In other words, they were more in the educational domain. Now we're looking at mental health, social and economic factors that are in our community, homeless students that are homeless. BVSD tracks and helps students that are homeless. This is a whole new domain, okay? So we kind of came forth as kind of, if you will, a casual way, the conscience of the education group saying, hey, with things getting as complex as it is, it would really benefit the board to have a panel of experts in each of these different domains help it with looking at the decision-making process and what to consider in making those decisions, because now they've gotten far-reaching.
Well, so the thing that I kind of zeroed in on was this one bullet item that was like, hey, let's think about repurposing some of the properties at BVSD for potential sites for housing. But I think what you're saying is it's more broad than that. It's more like, let's get some experts together that can speak to the whole issue of housing more generally, rather than like, let's start some projects here or there.
Absolutely, and do it with some precision. And let me give you a little background here. So I provide a place of residence for one BVSD employee, and that place of residence is provided to them at about $1,000 a month under market rates, so that they can actually have a decent place for their family to live and work in our community. Okay. And I got involved with doing that because I got so frustrated with trying to help this family out. And they're even with my resources to try and help them find a place to rent, it was just beyond their means. And Meghan can give us lots more information on this. And so that's how kind of I got my feet into the water, and then I learned a little more. And then when we got to the place that we're at today, where we're saying, I would venture to say on any given school day that we have in the current school year, there's probably not a school in the district that doesn't have a teacher shortage, meaning they have a teacher that's absent and they don't have a substitute to put in the classroom. So we've got a human resources issue, and it's not just education, it's healthcare, first responders, it's the whole community.
Great. Meghan, I've seen your mute button toggle a couple times. Jump in and say whatever you're waiting to say.
No, I just so appreciate this conversation and what Ralph has brought forward, both in this podcast, but also to the community in Boulder. When I think about where we're at as a state, as a county, Boulder County, and then the city specific of Boulder, I think it's no one would say we're in a good situation as far as housing goes. We're in a housing crisis. And part of what our work at Together Colorado is about is, one, to look at like, what are some of the systemic solutions around how do we actually get at this issue? And also, what's the narrative that needs to be developed? And so when I think about housing, I think about it as a human need. It's goes more from a commodity to where it's a home, it's a place where we can all lay our heads at night, a place where we can make our memories, where folks are able to feel safe and secure. And when we start to think about it in a values perspective, it changes our orientation of who deserves and who belongs, and how do we create a community where everyone's thriving. And so when I think about some of the different housing solutions that are out there, and we think about the systems of what Ralph is doing is amazing, what he's doing for this one family, and that's not enough. And so how do we scale what he's suggesting, and how do we scale to what is actually possible? And if there are these properties potentially, and with potentially a good amount of land and even buildings, there's some really neat creative ideas happening across the country and even in our own state that could start to look at how do we continue to keep our people threaded in the community and not have them to break up, or like Ralph says, having to like come in versus like live there and be a part of the fabric of our society. And so as we think about these different pieces, thinking about land trusts and housing trusts and low-income tax credits, mixed use housing, there's so many neat things out there. It takes work, and it takes, like Ralph said, we need experts at the table. And then what I would add is as the community experts. And so people on the ground, people experiencing the struggle of housing, all the way from the very low income of 30% AMI, area median income, all the way up to 50, 60, 80%, because we know there's a spectrum of folks who need housing, and there's a spectrum of support systems that are needed for these solutions. So it gets me excited to have conversations like this, because we can actually start thinking out of the box. And how do we keep this public space public and not have it just go into the private sector where more luxury apartments could happen, but actually, how do we actually build our community stronger and thriving?
Yeah, let me add, Philip, because I'll tell you where I can trace like a wizard. Okay, so one of the models that popped into my head is, if we look at a complex ecosystem, lakes and bogs will give way to a meadow, and you'll have a beautiful meadow, but the meadow doesn't last. It gets populated with trees and it becomes a forest. And so ecosystems have this really interesting self-organizing property. And if we're to take, as they age, right, and they mature, so a meadow that matures turns into a forest. And so if we look at that from our, our community environment, like Megan's talking about, we could have intelligent adaptation of property, reuse of property, reuse of public assets. And so in other words, instead of a community losing an elementary school, they could be gaining a medical facility with resident care, elderly, there's all the possibilities are endless. And so then it becomes really inviting. Wow, if we turned this over to people that actually really knew what they were doing and are not just a systems engineer like Ralph, the possibilities really abound. Okay, and so that's how this thing got rolling, and it's really about creativity, and it's about looking at creative problem solving that includes everyone, all voices, Because a society like ours can only thrive if all elements of the society are thriving.
Well, I really appreciate what both of you are saying. I think this issue of uh, speaking a narrative that we can that makes a way for us to have goals and work together. It's so difficult in this domain of housing because people have such a variety of negative emotions. People feel like I can't afford housing, and people who have housing feel like I don't want anything to change in my neighborhood. And there's just the ability to articulate a narrative that has a positive vision, like using the ecosystem metaphor, I think is beautiful because it is such a nice way to give a positive and realistic way of framing a very, very complex problem. I wanted to follow up. Go ahead.
And I think what you're touching on here, so there's a book written by Frank Wilczek, great quantum physicist, and he talks about the abundance that we have, and we get distracted by our opinion of scarcity when in fact we have a lot more than we really think about if we can look beyond it. Okay, so it gets about, gets to this really interesting. Can Ralph reframe the way I look at the world so that I can see the possibilities, not the scarcity?
Well, so I'd like to just dive way down to the ground level for a moment and have you give me a notion of something you'd like to see on a. I don't know if you're allowed to do this, but like maybe can you pick a specific BVSD property and say, if I were an autocrat, what I might do with this property, like in terms of community benefit?
Well, I'm going to do this in two parts, okay? Because I'm going to carry this so far and then pass it over to Meghan, Meghan's really steeped in housing. I've got the systems, I can see the opportunity, I can see the creativity. But after I spell housing, we've pretty well exhausted my knowledge of that subject, okay? So where I'll go with this is there's a number of properties on the west side that are elementary schools. And if we look at the long-term data, and I'll say 12 years, now that looks like eternity here, but there's going to be a cadence of when we're going to need not just one property, but we could have every other year be looking at closing a different property. Now, what property you and I might choose if we were just looking at it from the needs of the children might be, we might decide, well, hey, we should be really closing Flatirons Elementary. But if we looked at it, the needs of the community, we say, hey, maybe we should really keep Flatirons, and because this other property has so much more land that's associated with it, or it's in a better location for a high density housing. And by the way, we could put a medical facility by it, or those kinds of things. So in terms of looking at predominantly what the need is first is the elementary schools. As the kids grow up, the elementary schools lose their enrollment first, then it moves through the middle school. And so it may even be where we create some K-8s, the educators can come up with lots of really interesting things. So now what do you do with a cadence where it's not one school, but it's now possibilities of schools? And what does urban planning tell us we might be able to do with those when we look at the socioeconomic needs of the community? So with that, Meghan, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful way to frame too kind of the transition of how populations kind of grow and diminish in different ways. And when we think about the possibilities, I love how Ralph started with, yes, there's housing, and then there's these mental health and behavioral health type supports, and how are we thinking about all these systems interconnected? Because we know when trying to solve problems, if you're unhoused, it's really difficult to have proper behavioral health services and have a healthy body and mind, because you're trying to meet all these other survival needs. And then just thinking about trying to make it to school and do your homework. And so if we start to think about these things all interconnected, I think, as Ralph has pointed out, there are ways that we can begin to address. And we also know without having stable housing, a safe place to live, it's hard to meet some of the other needs. And so what's been fun to start to research and see what's happening across the country, we see different models around, there was a model in Philadelphia that took an old middle school and transitioned it into like 38 affordable housing units for 30% AMI. And so there are models out there. A group in Kansas City is working on an experiment where they're calling it the MINT model, Mixed Income Neighborhood Trust, where you buy up several properties and then you create a land trust underneath those properties, and then say a percentage, maybe 25% are at market rate, and then the other 75% are a fixed rate rental and basically only increase with inflation, but the whole property is able to finance itself. And so suddenly, rather than having segregated communities of this is where lower income folks live, this is a higher income, we're actually integrating our folks and providing a sustainable way to continue. There's other projects where many folks would love to buy, and becoming a first-time home buyer is almost impossible just about anywhere in Colorado right now. And so how are we thinking about models that help folks rent to buy, or what are different supports that are needed? And as we think about it as like a city, and as a city of like thinking about the housing trust models that are actually in place, some of our work has to be more targeted. It can't just be like, let's help all first-time home buyers. But if we take an equity lens and start to think about who has been traditionally shut out by the market, who is traditionally in our lower income earning sectors, and then have been maybe even more drastically impacted by the pandemic, and how are we starting to use what Pastor says, like targeted universalism, so that when we do support specific populations, it's actually supporting all of us. Because what Ralph was saying is, we have to move from scarcity to abundance. We actually do have enough, and people don't have to lose. Like, just because I own a home doesn't mean I will lose all the hard work that I've gained to get there. It's actually about building a resilient community for all of us. And I think there's so many things out there that are, like I said, they're transformative, but they're also creative. And we have this opportunity with the particular situation in the city of Boulder and the school system right now.
So let me simplify this a little bit, Philip, because, when we talk about land trusts and we talk about, and Meghan, could you clarify for everybody what 30% affordable means?
Yeah, so AMI is often a term you hear thrown around. It's the area median income. So anywhere, whether it's the city of Boulder, whether it's Denver, there's an area median income. And often when we talk about affordable housing, we have to be really clear about affordable for whom. And so sometimes it could be 80% AMI. So whatever that average area median income is, 80% of that is for people who qualify. The lower we target, it becomes harder to afford to build that. But that's kind of what.
And just to be clear, are there two AMIs that are generally used? I would guess that one for Boulder City and one for Boulder County. Is that a thing, or what's the AMI that you normally use?
I think it depends on what city you're looking at. So like Lafayette, Louisville would be very different than the city of Boulder.
I see.
So let me get to a really interesting kind of simplify the conundrum here, Philip. And when we talk about abundance, recently there was an article, a lovely article written in the Daily Camera about now's the time to go all electric for housing, right? And there's all these efficient appliances. And I wrote the author of the article, and said, it may be just a little bit premature because Colorado still in the month of November generated 36% of its electricity on coal. Now, coal's not bad. And as we're adding a lot of electric vehicles into the domain of power demand, we want to balance this need for moving from coal to more environmentally friendly with the needs of the community, right? You don't want to just necessarily go out and start shutting off coal plants, right? And housing works very similarly, except it's a little more convoluted. In other words, in the power system, everybody generates and puts it on the grid. In other words, when you turn your light switch on in your home, you really don't know where that power got generated from, right? Because everybody generates and puts on the grid. We all pull off the grid. If we could look at housing within a community or resources, whether they're healthcare, whether we're talking about food resources, the well-being of our community members, and we look at them as kind of that network of resources so that we can meet some of the needs in all of the economic brackets, whether it's 30% AMI or it's 60%, because here's the really interesting thing. 4 years ago, what you and I would have called affordable might have been, hey, we just need some housing for 60% AMI or 70% AMI. But because housing has jumped so much, if we're going to look at making housing available for, like I said, an engineer that's a specialist with the fire department, they're a hydrologist, they run the engine, the pressures, flows, all that, very specialized people. We might be talking 30-40% AMI,
and we want them in our community.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. You do not want to be trying to put out a fire without having an engineer at the pump.
That's right.
At the engine that generates all the pump. And so it's a moving target and it's flow. And if we can get into the dialogue, I think that's the first step. Get into the dialogue. So what do our first responders say? What are the needs of the community? What are the needs? Boy, I'll tell you, if we were going to sit down and listen to a group of nurses tell us what they really need, I'm certain we would get an earful.
I keep expecting you to say a group of teachers or paras or administrative staff.
Them as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and let's think about it for a second. If we're going to get a substitute to go into an elementary school in Boulder, odds are that substitute doesn't live within the city of Boulder. How do we make that available to them, right? And by the way, we're not the first community that faced this. So I worked for a telecommunication company that provided services in an area for which none of our field techs actually lived within the footprint of the property. And we looked at purchasing property so that when they were on call and they were having to service the area, they had places that they could spend the night. So they weren't driving 40 miles both ways, right?
Yeah. Where should we go next?
Well, the first thing I'd like to throw out here is this is not an impossible problem to solve. Okay. Right. I want to encourage everyone that listens to your podcast to say, if we look at some of the challenges that we have solved with healthcare, vaccines, polio, whatever topic you happen to be aware of, this is a problem that we can actually resolve, but we can't resolve it without each of us in the community changing our mindset and becoming more adaptive in terms of looking at possibilities. And so one of the things that I challenge myself to is to realize that the problems that are in front of me are not for me to solve, they're to solve me, they're to fix me. In other words, I can't address that problem, but how do I change so that I'm not contributing to that problem? So this is an evolutionary kind of a consciousness. And this is about some of the work you're doing, Phil. It's about raising awareness. How do we raise awareness? How do we get to dialogue?
Yeah, and I would add to that, I love that. And I would add, as a community organizer, it's about going deep into our communities and having those conversations. And part of it is building relationship, right? Across sector, across race, across who is my neighbor? Who do I want to be my neighbor? And part of Organizing 101 says, power is in the relationship. We always talk about how do we build power? We say it's organized people, organized money, organized ideas. And here, when we're starting to organize our community and think about what's the community I want? We start with the world as it is, and then we want to move, how do we get to the world as it should be, the beloved community where we want to go? And we can't do that without being in right relationship and really understanding, where are you coming from, Ralph? Philip, what's your perspective, and where are you starting at? What's the values that we actually hold central, and what's the Boulder we want to see? And I think if we can start there, as Ralph said, this isn't impossible. We've got folks who care about this from a systems level, folks who this impacts directly. And as we can gather together and actually listen and hear each other, not forgetting folks, you don't need an education, you don't need a master's degree. It's your lived experience is just as important. And so when I push folks in community to say, please, not only talk amongst yourselves, but talk to your city council folks, talk to your school board, share where you're coming from, because we all have a role to play and our voices matter. And we can't get to the world as we want, or the beloved community, if we're all not engaged in that.
I love that, because when I think about like my own personal problem solving and me trying to navigate this space of housing, I rent a house and I worry about the rent going up when the lease is up, and I start thinking, well, okay, if I'm gonna buy a house, I need to save up this much money. I need to have this kind of income, and I need to think about how much money I need to earn. And so my brain kind of goes into this, like, how do I maximize my little economic output, so that I can work this system. And that's sort of like speaks to what Ralph said about, the system has to solve us to some extent. Like, I want to reorient the way I think about all of this in a way that doesn't just, it's not just about me out competing others, And when you talk about a beloved community, I have real desires along these lines about, like, I want to live in a pedestrian district that's walkable, where it's highly socially connected, and I want all kinds of people to live there with me, and I want there to be live entertainment at the local cafe, and all these things that I don't know how to get there from here.
So let's go there. Okay, so
yeah.
First thing I want to point out to you is that in the last 4 years, you cannot save fast enough to close in on a piece of property. Okay, in other words, the property is leaving you at the speed of light. Okay.
No,
okay. So,
as a renter, I've noticed.
yeah. Okay, so there's a group that I love and I pay attention to. They're called the People's Supper, and their theme applies to us. And the People's Supper, and this is a quote from their kind of mantra, goes, "We use shared meals to build trust and connection among people of different identities and perspectives." Now, here's the key for us, Philip. We believe that social change moves at the speed of relationships, and that relationships can only move at the speed of trust. So now we're into this trust piece. How do we build trust? Whoa.
It's a great question, because we have what that reminds me of is this sort of political imbalance that we have, where the incumbents don't trust newcomers, and the newcomers don't always know who they are, with respect to some specific project or something. And so I don't know, that speed of trust actually kind of depresses me at first blush.
Well, go ahead, Megan.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting because, like, the newcomers and the folks who've been here, but also like thinking about communities who have been traditionally marginalized, and just understanding like what it takes to actually meet them where they're at, listen to them, and how do we build trust? Because I don't think we can get to the place we want if there isn't some kind of trust building. And I think sometimes in our society, we want to move really fast. We've got, and especially when we're in crisis, it's like, what's the next thing to do? What's the next change? And then people get left behind, and it's like, who has enough resources gets to move forward. And I think we're trying to reorient us and say, yes, we need to meet needs. And how do we do that collectively versus just the individual, right? Because it's about all of us versus just me getting what I need.
Yeah. So now I'm going to ask you a question after I give you the next piece here, Philip. See, because Megan's talking about if we go slow enough to build trust, we'll actually get there sooner, right? So here's a really interesting statistic that I share with people, and I was involved with one of them, not the latest, but Before NASA could change on its manned flight program, it had to lose 2 shuttles. When it lost the first shuttle, they considered that to be a fluke. It wasn't until they lost the second shuttle that they realized that the organization had dysfunctional behavior, okay? And they changed. Fast forward along, we had to lose 2 737 Maxes before Boeing would, okay. So in other words, if we move too quickly, there are consequences to that if we don't bring everybody along. And if we can bring everybody along and recognize that the person that's different than I, brings something to the table that I cannot bring, a perspective that I cannot get to, then now we're open to some possibilities and some real changing, because then I'm open to myself being changed, that I'm not seeing the world as it really is, right?
Yeah. And I feel like what you're suggesting too, Ralph, means that there may be some tension and we can't be afraid of it. Like we have to lean into it, because change doesn't happen without tension and without, like you said, changing a perspective or hearing something different or uncomfortable. And if we really want to lean, or we're inviting ourselves to lean into that, I think that's where the creativity and possibilities come, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Well, so Meghan, I love the way that you you have a very hopeful and a very well, I'm not sure how to characterize it, but it's also a little abstract. So how does the rubber hit the road for you in terms of like manifesting these values or these aspirations?
Yeah, I mean, in my day-to-day work, I'm on the ground with community members, talking to them and saying, what are the needs here? And are you willing to do something about it? Right. So when we're in, for example, we're in Lafayette right now, we're working really deeply with our mobile home residents, and mobile homes are the last naturally occurring affordable housing. They're the unsubsidized housing, and they're at great risk of leaving. And so when I think about that, when I work with residents and we say, okay, so how do we organize for change? How do we ensure that we can create sustainability here? But it's not just about them, it's also about the surrounding community, and helping educate folks around, mobile home parks and what are they about, with the idea that these are my neighbors. Like I actually want to make sure I don't lose my neighbor, and that this is another way to exist beyond just a single family home or an apartment complex. And so I think for me, like how the rubber meets the road, it's actually working with individuals one-on-one, building up a stronger base of people, doing that political analysis and understanding how can we make systemic change? How do we change policy? How do we change zoning? And some of those pieces, it gets complicated, but it's also like, what are the levers of power? So yes, like I try to have a hopeful view, but I also know this is the long game and it's hard. And so how do you create the resilience to start at the very beginning of relationship building, analyzing what's the problem and how do we start to attack it? And then who can we move to make those changes?
And here's a little bit. So if we're looking at getting the shoe onto the foot, it really is inviting at times to have a shoehorn. And the shoehorn gives us guidance, okay? It keeps us from just plowing the foot into the shoe, and here's how that works, Philip, from my perspective that Meghan just reflected on. Until we recognize that we as members of our community are somewhat at risk, until we make this a safe place for everybody, the change is really pretty hard. Meaning, I talked to a lady who at the Louisville Rec Center, that's where I work out, who said she thought her house was the safest house in the entire community. They were 100 yards from the fire station and about 300 yards from the police station. And she said, my house burned to the ground. It was a false safety that she said, I had no idea, right? And I just serve that up as an example, because a lot of the times we especially in communities of privilege, we feel safe within the abutment of the institutions that are around us, okay? And one of the interesting aspects about education is that education systems, school districts, work really well when they are less segregated. There's a bunch of research that was done out of Stanford and a couple of other really spent a lot of time on it, and they concluded that the more integrated and more interaction there was across race and different classes of people, the healthier and the more mature and the more academic advancement that you got across the whole district. So if we subscribe to that, then we first of all got to recognize the school district can't solve that problem, right? Because it's where kids live, right, and where their parents choose to live, and how do we bus kids, and where do children go to school? And so once it becomes a collective, and we realize that the collective has greater value than the individual, then that now there's the possibility for change. Now there's the possibility for trust, awareness, enculturation.
When I think about feeling safe in my home, there's kind of two themes that surface. One is the community I live in resilient, and and that comes from all kinds of places. Is there the kinds of people that do you have the engineer for the end of the for the hydraulics or whatever? Do you have all kinds of people that give perspective and whatnot? So I think a diverse community is really important for resilience. And then there's this other aspect of like security. Am I going to live in a gated community and build up walls and to keep out the thugs and the thieves? There's kind of that way of looking at safety. And I just feel like Boulder. I live in the city of Boulder. I know we're kind of talking more generally Boulder County today, but I just feel like Boulder's really at a place where if it doesn't embrace diversity and resilience, it's going to pivot hard towards security, and I just dread that for my city. I don't know if that resonates with you at all, but
yeah, I mean, and my question is security for whom, right?
Yeah, right.
Like,
Well,
but as a white person, my definition of security is very different for a person of color, for an immigrant person, and I think what we can often do is, like you said, you can have your metaphorical or your real walls that you're building up, and really the invitation I feel like here today is, how do we not lean in that way and actually say, I want to be a part of this conversation. It's tough when I hear about my school closing, and I know my community is hurting in other ways. How do we come together and say, could there be a repurposing? Could there be a way that folks can actually live here and thrive here? Is there a way that we can connect services to housing? And I think we're at this it's an important moment for the County of Boulder. Like, which way do we want to go? How do we want to be defined? Is it a community that builds walls metaphorically or real to keep people out, whoever that is? Or do we want to say, actually, we want to redefine who my neighbor is?
Absolutely.
And here's the beauty of this when we start to think like that, is that Rob Anderson, who's the superintendent, his staff, the teachers that are in this community have been wanting to do great things for kids and their students all along. And there are limitations to what they can do when the community is really divided on issues of social and economic standards, okay? Just look at it when we went through the recommendation 2 years ago to replace SROs with people that have mental health and trauma-informed kind of guidance to help kids along. That was a dialogue that took a while for the community to really come to grips with. And there's still some people that say, well, why did we do that? And if you don't understand all of the aspects of being a minority student, feeling vulnerable around uniform officers, it doesn't carry the same meaning. And so, these are the kinds of dialogues that I think can bring us together.
I feel like the kind of community that I want to live in is a sort of irresistible draw that once we get it started, it'll build on itself, and people will want to participate, and people minds will be open. There's an aspect of it where it's like, you don't know that you want the iPhone until you see it in your hand. And so I want to build some neighborhoods, some pilots perhaps, or like repurpose some school properties and show how beautiful that they can be, and the kind of community that organically develops from that. And then show people that, hey, the kind of resilient communities that we're talking about that are beloved are irresistible, and we need more of them and more of that.
So I'll give you a really interesting dichotomy. These are the kinds of things that I ponder, Philip. When I think about you as a renter that would like to be an owner at some time, I'm constantly reminded of Napoleon Bonaparte sells the Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson. Now, where the hell did he get title to that property? Because he certainly didn't talk to the inhabitants that were there, and they had they had no idea. A title, or the Hudson Bay Company sells a large section of property to Eric Selkirk in I think it was Norway, or Sweden, and they came migrating there. That becomes Winnipeg. Now, where did the heck did the Hudson Bay Company get title to 100,000 square miles or whatever it was that they sold? They sold this on a title, right? There were people that were living there. They're going, wait a minute, what do you mean you got a title? So there are some really strange things that we've really gotten accustomed to, right?
Yeah, so you're saying about like my notion of wanting my own little title of my own little quarter acre of Boulder County. That's kind of what you're is the message to me sort of like
no, why should I have title? Why should I have a title?
Yeah.
I guess for me, thinking back, I love how you use that word irresistible. Like, could we create a community that it's irresistible in the sense of I'm drawn to it because I can see myself in it. I can see myself in my neighbor, thinking about as a Coloradan, as a Boulder County resident, like Black, brown, white, young, elderly, veteran, immigrant, like, can I see myself there? And can we make the way for a community where everyone can thrive? It's sustainable. It's a place where we have a backyard barbecue. We go, walk down the street together. It's a place where we all can lay our head at night, and we see housing as this communal human need. And it's a place that we value, and we can value one another. So a place where I can see myself, see my neighbor, and it's, we're building the beloved community together.
I love it. Well, we still have a few minutes. Any other parting shots?
Well, let me just share this with you. I've worked on more difficult problems than this. If in fact we can get the dialogue started, if we can have conversation, if county superintendents can meet with Rob Anderson and they can truly share the data, okay, so that the people that are in the know, that have the expertise, the Meghan Carriers, the Together Colorados, the county supervisors, the whole, the healthcare, the first responder, if they could get together, wouldn't it be interesting to be a fly in that room?
Yeah. Well, I would like to, when I think about the fact that this bullet item showed up in that District Accountability Committee report to the board, I would like to kind of replay some of the conversations you must have had saying, hey, should we throw up this idea for repurposing school properties? That's a powerful way to get a conversation started.
Well, everybody on the finance committee was all bought into that, and they were just kind of coming to this place that says, look, we can't keep doing what we're doing. How do we change process? How do we move to a higher level of consciousness or awareness?
Yeah.
And of course, me being me, I couldn't resist the temptation to bring that one forward. Come on, let's have fun with this.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for participating today. It's such an interesting conversation. I hope we can do this again, actually.
Yes, thank you.
Indeed.
For the invitation.